Great. Um, as we adjust our cameras, welcome all to our first grounded book club of the season, but also our first book club period of the 2024-25 season of HD Live in Schools. We're thrilled to be focusing on Janine Tesori's Grounded for the next couple of weeks as students get ready to see it in theaters this weekend and the encore next Wednesday. And we are absolutely thrilled to be joined by one of the architects of Grounded, Paul Cremo, the Met's dramaturg. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, thanks. Glad to be here.
So Paul is the Met's dramaturg, and I'll have him explain what that means in a moment. But it's also important to note that he oversees the opera commissioning program at the Metropolitan Opera, as well as the Met Opera Lincoln Center Theater New Works program. So Paul, in a few words, can you describe what it is a dramaturg does or what you do at the Met?
Well, I have a kind of specific version of being a dramaturg at different opera companies or theaters. A dramaturg can be very different things. In some places and some opera companies, a dramaturg might be responsible for doing the translations for the subtitles or for gathering research materials for a director who wants to set, Carmen on Mars, and they'll get all that research together and help the director kind of formulate their take on the approach. A dramaturg might write program notes or lead panel discussions. I don't really do most of those things, but instead I'm overseeing the development of new operas at the Met and evaluating and being part of the process when we're doing already existing but fairly recent contemporary operas at the Met. And sometimes we get involved with revising or making changes to those existing works, and I get involved there too. But the biggest part of my job is overseeing brand new works that we're commissioning in two different ways. We have, as you mentioned, Nick, the Metropolitan Opera Lincoln Center New Works program, which is a program for opera composers who are just starting out, perhaps writing their first or maybe their second opera. And that program ends with a workshop, which is a week in a room with singers and a piano. And we just have the singers learn it and be able to, by the end of the week, to be able to sing through it convincingly and with commitment, so we can get a sense of how the piece is working. At that point, we may say, thank you very much, that was great. Or we may say, this is intriguing, let's develop it further and let's give you a full commission and put a date on the calendar to produce the work. And in one case so far, one of those works has been produced at Lincoln Center Theater, an opera called Intimate Apparel, which was done in their small theater because it was kind of a chamber opera. And in several instances, those pieces went on to be given a full commission at the Met with a date on the calendar and a full production. And that includes Grounded, also Eurydice by Matthew O'Coin, and Two Boys by Nico Muhly. Several works have gone on from that New Works program beyond the workshop phase to actually be produced. In other instances, composers who are more experienced, we just give them a full commission. We say, we'll put this on the calendar, give you a date 5 years from now or whatever. And that we plan operas very far in advance here because we have to make sure we can get stars and conductors and directors who are very much in demand. And also we like to work in an out-of-town tryout, we call it, where the opera is performed somewhere else for its world premiere. And then that's usually a year before it comes to the Met. This enables us to see the work in another venue with an audience and with all the lights and costumes and full out acting, orchestra. And it's only then that you really have a sense of what you've got and what is working and what maybe could be improved. So then we've got a little less than a year after that to get it ready and do revisions and kind of spiff it up for the Met.
Right. And it occurs to me that several of the titles we've done in HD Live in Schools have passed through this kind of process that you're talking about, either getting a full commission right off the bat or going through the development process. Was Marnie one of those that was just a full commission?
Marnie was a full commission because Nico Muhly had already written Two Boys
right,
and another couple operas. So by that point, we felt he was experienced enough to give him a full commission.
Right. And then there was the Hours, which was a full commission. And then Eurydice, I think, was that workshopped, or was that also a full commission?
The Eurydice by Matthew O'Coin and Sarah Rule came out of the New Works program,
Oh, awesome.
and then was moved forward once it was clear that it was right. He was writing a terrific piece.
And then, of course, we have the two Terence Blanchard operas, Champion and Fire Shut Up in My Bones, which went through were not part of the commissioning program or the New Works program, but were revised as they got to the Met stage, which we talked about.
Yes, they performed elsewhere. Yeah, for some in the case of Champion several times, and then we thought that there could be some revisions to make it more ready for the Met, and about 20% of those pieces were changed for their Met premieres.
So how does Grounded come about? I've heard versions of this story, probably from you and from other people. But does it start with the play Grounded? Does it start with the composer?
Yes.
What's the sort of like initial germ of Grounded?
We commissioned Janine Tesori way back, I think even before I arrived at the Met in 2007. And she had a playwright she was going to work with on an original story, but it just never came together. And we gave them a while to try different ways of looking at it, and it just never happened. So at some point in 2014, I said, this isn't happening. Let's just agree to part company, and Janine, let's find something else for you to do. And she started thinking about things, and then I went to see a play at this little off-Broadway theater, Soho Rep, down in Tribeca, and saw this play Grounded. And this woman came out onto the stage. It was a one-woman play, basically a long monologue. And this woman came out with short cropped hair and a zip-up flight suit, and told the story of what it was like being a female fighter pilot who was the best at what she did. But when she went away to have a baby, when she came back, they reassigned her to operating a drone. And there was something about that character that made me think of Janine. Here is a strong, super competent woman in a world surrounded by men, a traditionally male field, the story wasn't about, oh, it's hard to be a woman and the guys are rough on me. No, she was better than the guys. She was the best at what she did. And her conflict was how she upheld her own standards and what she started to go through in terms of the trauma experienced by the new job that she was given. So I had Janine come to see it. And first of all, I just thought, this is crazy. This is a one-woman show. There's no way this could be an opera.
Yeah.
Or could it? Yeah. It was an intriguing challenge. But I thought, let's see what Janine says. So I had her come to see the play. By that time, it had closed, but it was playing in Washington, D.C. So we went down to Washington, D.C. to see it. And in a production that had been imported from London. And she loved it. And immediately said, I think I see an opera in this and I could do it. And we put her together with the playwright, George Brandt, and he was game for writing the libretto and adapting it and filling it out with all the characters that the pilot talked about in the play as real living singing characters, plus a chorus and dancers and all that. There was some concern early on, like, could this be big enough for the Met? Could it fill the Met stage? And even though it's a fairly intimate story in some ways, there's not tons of characters, but the ideas are big, was my thinking. The ideas and the emotions are big. And I felt that it might work on the Met stage. Then Janine, when we started talking about directors, her first choice was Michael Mayer, whom she was an old friend of and had worked on projects with Broadway, musicals and things like that. And he was really game to do it. And it was something very different for him. And he loves a challenge and he loves doing different things, going from one thing to another. All the pieces he does are quite different. So we started working on it. And George Brandt, the librettist, I started talking to him about what a libretto is, because it was his first time writing one. I sent him examples of other opera librettos so he could sort of bone up on that. He watched operas, watched our HD presentations, and came to the Met a few times. One thing that Janine and George wanted to do, I thought was interesting, right at the very start. They just wanted to be sure that these words would work on the Met stage. we had an actress come and stand on the stage one afternoon after Bohème rehearsal, and the actress just recited the lines. She was an actress who had done Grounded. She recited the lines of some of the big moments of the monologue, the play. And Janine and George kind of walked around the different places and sat in different seats and got the sense of, what do we like to hear those words in this house? And they walked away thinking, okay, I think this could work. So George set off, wrote the libretto, went through many drafts. During the lockdown, we would get on Zooms and read through it and talk through it. We did a reading of the libretto with the opera's stars who would perform it at the Met, which was really helpful and interesting. And then when Janine started composing, we would have regular meetings every 3 weeks with George, Janine, Michael Mayer, and I on Zoom during the lockdown. And she would sort of play through the material that she was writing, and we would discuss it and suggest changes or say it's great. Mostly it was just that it was great. But we debate about a certain word or a certain musical gesture. And she worked on it all through that period until we had a full score that we could do in a workshop to start that process.
It seems like, I think of your job in this instance as being almost like a kind of matchmaker. Like, you have a play that you saw, source material, and you thought this could be really interesting. You have a composer who you've already worked with, and you're looking for a topic or a subject or a source material, and you're putting them together and hoping things are serendipitous. So what is that? How do you sort of manage those relationships and those introductions, and sort of trying to get two people in a room that maybe have not been in a room together, and hoping that it works, with the knowledge that, as with Janine's first attempted project with the Met, it might not come to fruition?
Yeah. I mean, it is like matchmaking. It is like a relationship, like a romantic relationship. These people are going to be spending a long time together. As you know, it took 10 years between me seeing that play in August 2014 and the opera arriving on the Met stage. So they're going to have to get along. They're going to have to be kind of philosophically aligned in terms of what they're trying to do with this piece, what the piece is about to begin with, then how it might be transformed as an opera, into an opera, and what, how some things might shift. Even some elements of the message and the theme of the opera might shift on its way to becoming an opera, of the play on its way to becoming an opera. So, my method is just to put them together and let them get to know each other, then to kind of observe and moderate and monitor their communications. And I was pretty much in the conversations from the beginning straight through. So I could, not that they ever had any conflicts or problems, but I could just make sure that they were understanding each other, and that the interests of the Met were being looked after, and that Janine was getting the support she needed, and that George was making sure, he was being heard, and trying to just, balance all of those different aspects.
Yeah, it's being a matchmaker and a kind of moderator, facilitator. It's much more than a matchmaker, because matchmakers don't usually hang around once the couple.
No, that's true. Yes, I was part of. It became more like a threesome or a foursome.
Yeah.
So and I was an editor, a cheerleader, a taskmaster, a schedule minder, fly on the wall, a different perspective. I would have to kind of alternate between perspectives of knowing the play and knowing what was going on with the opera, and sometimes trying to forget all that and try to imagine myself as the audience coming to this for the first time. Would they understand this? Is there a better way of saying that line to somebody who's coming to a cold? It's easy, when you're familiar with the material, it's easy to sort of assume that it's all going to work and make sense and people will get it. And sometimes you're surprised that the audience they miss a detail or it's not clear. So I had to constantly bounce back and forth between deep in it to zooming out and seeing, how would people imagine how people would take this as an audience the first time they'd encounter it.
And I'm intrigued by the idea. Well, we've talked a lot in these book clubs with Michael Christopher and with Kevin Putz about what is a libretto, which is such a strange form it's not really a play, it's not really a poem, but it's kind of both. And different libretti do different things. Sometimes most of the time they're adapted, sometimes they're original. Which libretti did you give George Brant to sort of peruse, and what do you look for, if you can remember, and what do you think makes for a good libretto, or takes something, what happens in the process from play, which Grounded is quite a short play, but even a libretto has to be even more limited in terms of
pithy.
Pithy, exactly. What do you look for in a libretto, and how can you tell when it feels like it's getting to that point?
I gave him, if I recall correctly, I gave him some things that were Met projects, like Eurydice and Intimate Apparel, which were both based on plays and written by the playwright. So I thought that was interesting for him to see. I gave him Royce Vavrek's libretto for Breaking the Waves, which Missy Mazzoli composed, which was adapted from a movie. And it was a woman's, female-centric story. I don't know if I gave him this, but I usually give people Gene Shear's libretto for Moby Dick, because it's just a sterling example of adapting a book and condensing and telling in really concise terms some big events. So I think those were a few of the things I gave him.
And what do you think makes a libretto exemplary, or something, especially when it's an adaptation from another source, which is tricky?
It is tricky. And, in the theater world, the playwright is king or queen, and they write their idea and everybody kind of bends over backwards to try to make sure what's in their head is getting put on the stage. And so the words are right out front, and it's all about the words and the actors, but a librettist has to be a little bit more self-effacing and step back and hand over their words to the composer, who's then going to take them and run with them. And it's not for everybody. Some librettists, some playwrights or writers of any kind, just they don't want to give up that control or primacy, and they don't like somebody else kind of messing with their work. So that's another thing. I mean, George Brant, is very kind, diplomatic. He's not a difficult person, and that's important too for a collaboration. But as far as what makes a good libretto, especially one for the Met, I always tell people we want. I think I mentioned this too. We want big ideas, big emotions, characters that clearly want something. A main character is going after something, and then the conflict is what is the conflict? What gets in the way of that person getting what they're trying to accomplish or go after? And then how do they resolve that conflict? How do they struggle with the challenges, and how do they move through them to some kind of resolution? Pretty standard dramatic stuff. For the Met audiences, I think if there's a hot button theme, an interesting social, political, current topic, that's good because it's engaging. If it's based on something that people know, that's helpful for marketing. The Hours was a book and a movie that people knew about. So when you combine that with 3 starry leading ladies, you could see the poster even just from the first meeting, and you could see how you would market it, and you could see why people would be interested and why a Met audience would be interested, a sophisticated literary audience that would like to almost be flattered by the subject matter. Oh, Virginia Woolf. Oh, I've read Virginia Woolf. Here's an opera. I know those references. For an opera like Lincoln and the Bardo, which is coming up in a couple of years, it's a well-regarded book, award-winning book by a very highly thought of writer. And it's got Lincoln in the title. And it's about Lincoln mourning his son. So it's an emotional story. So that seemed to be a good fit. The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, which will open the season next year, is also a Pulitzer Prize winning, best-selling novel that a lot of people have read. Very colorful story, colorful characters, World War II in 1940s New York City, 2 cousins who create a comic book superhero that becomes a huge hit, and they use it to fight Nazis. And, how can you go wrong with that? It's history, it's colorful, it's period, it's set in New York. all these things I think would be appealing to a Met audience.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that a lot of these are also sort of big historical moments. I mean, I think of World War II, I think of Lincoln and the Bardo in the Civil War, I think of, even Grounded has a sense of like this new kind of warfare
Yes.
that we're living with and we know is omnipresent, but we don't necessarily think about it or see it all that much. And I wonder if that's also part of the process of identifying source material or a subject is making its context or its framework sort of legible to a broad audience. Like this is a historical moment that you know something about, and it's not the most obscure thing in the world. And so you already coming into it have some way to sort of grasp what's going on.
Yeah, and then maybe you're curious about knowing more about it. One of the operas that's in our New Works program is based. It's about the creation of Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water House in Pennsylvania. And that's something that's like a cultural touchstone that a lot of people know about, but do they know the story about how it came to be and the commission and the family that commissioned it and the internecine dramas of the father, mother, and son who were important in getting that commission to happen. Yeah, I'm a fan of history. I'm a fan of art. I'm a fan of literature. I'm a fan of music, of course. So anything that hits those sweet spots is intriguing to me, and I think to Met audiences as well.
Yeah, I would have never imagined an opera about falling water. So I'm already like, that sounds interesting. I want to know what the gossip is about that whole process. For Grounded, this is just a question that's been on my mind for a while. Was there ever a conversation about doing a one-woman opera? And even just for a moment, I know it's sort of impractical for the Met stage, but there is this kind of tradition of doing a sort of monodrama. Was that even in the picture?
It was never really considered. I mean, it certainly could have been done that way for a smaller house somewhere. Right. And that would have been a kind of logical thing to do. And it was rather crazy to do anything but that. It was definitely a gamble. It was a risk. It was an experiment to see if this thing that would be most obvious, its most obvious form would be a monodrama opera, La Voix Humaine, right. That would make sense. And it would be fairly easy by comparison. Mm-hmm. Building it out was really challenging in a lot of ways to take something that had worked in one form and transform it into another approach.
Yeah. So speaking of building it out, there's also a process of maybe, I don't know what the right phrase would be, but sort of bringing it down, right? Because you took it to Washington National Opera for its first run as sort of out of town tryout, as you said. And then there were some revisions in the following 12 months or so to get it ready for the Met, which was, from what I've heard from Janine and others, a process of revision that was a lot of some cutting, some remixing, some restructuring. So what is that revision process like? And what is your role as the sort of moderator, matchmaker, facilitator, proxy audience in that revision process?
The thing about Grounded that it turned out rather surprisingly is there was so much story contained in that short monodrama that once you started making those characters real, you can just say a couple of lines that say, I went home and I had an argument with my husband. But if you're going to write the scene, then that, poof, it's suddenly taking up 5 minutes. And multiply all those. And her story was so interesting. I mean, the whole thing of where she started and hanging out with the guys and enjoying being, going out for a beer and doing what she did so well. And then the whole process of meeting her husband and, eventual husband and getting pregnant and all that, taking time away, and her daughter was born a little too early, so she needed extra care. All these things. We started out thinking, oh, well, we've got to include that. We've got to include that. We've got to build up her story before she even gets to the drone to show the progression and to make us care about her marriage and her child, because those are the things that are going to be threatened. But what we learned in Washington, because some things you only really learn by sitting with an audience, which someone has said the audience is the final character in any drama. They are really part of what's going on. And it's only when all the lights are on, the costumes, the full out performances, and the audience is reacting, you think, oh, you don't really need that. Or, oh, they're not quite getting that part. Or, oh, we could just move along here. Or the opposite, like, this is really good. Maybe we could expand this. They're really enjoying this part. So we learned a lot of those things in Washington. And Janine, in a way that's singular of any composer I've ever encountered, is absolutely up for anything it takes to make the piece better. She's not precious at all about cutting things, changing things, what we call killing our babies. Mm-hmm. She is ruthless about it. She came back from Washington saying it's got to be shorter, it's got to be clearer, it's got to be better. And it's not that it was bad at Washington. I mean, people really enjoyed it. It was longer, and there's some really good scenes in there because George is a good writer, and it's an interesting story, and the stuff that happens with her meeting her husband and all that is interesting. It just was felt like, we got to get her in that trailer. We got to get there sooner, And then we also had much more about, when she was in the trailer, the boring days, passing the time, drinking Pepsi after Pepsi, and tracking different people, and the relationship with the censor next to her. But we just realized, showing boredom can be boring. And if you go back and forth between home and the trailer too many times in one act, you just feel like, and we thought, okay, we can convey the boredom, we can convey the routine in a couple trips to the trailer and a couple trips back home. There were driving scenes of her driving home and meditating and philosophizing about what was going on, and being haunted by, and we finally realized, like, we don't have to have a bunch of driving scenes. We could have one driving scene. There was a scene where she's clearly coming unglued, and Eric is worried about her, and he decides to make her a mix CD, mm-hmm. in which he includes the song, the little lullaby that he sings to their daughter. And that when she's really stressed out and hyperventilating, and when she pulls over to the side of the road, she puts that CD in that he's given her, and it calms her down, which is a really lovely scene. But we just felt, can we do it? It's really, can you live without, if it's not absolutely necessary to keeping the show constantly moving forward at all times, then you get rid of it. And that's what we did.
Yeah, it's a hard process. I remember talking to Anthony Davis about revising X, 35 years after it premiered. And that's sort of the extreme of 4 decades later, revise your first opera. And this is the opposite extreme, which is you have a year, decide what's going to stay and what's going to go. And it's a fascinating process. And talking to Janine about it, she's been you're right, so open and so almost enthusiastic about the process of revision. Yeah. And that's actually part of the work. It's not just
that's how she works.
It's other thing. It's composing is revising.
Yes. And I wish more composers understood that. But in her world of theater, you take a show out on the road. You do it in Boston or Philadelphia or wherever, or Chicago for 3 weeks, and you rewrite every single day. And it's easier for stage actors or singers to put in changes overnight and then perform them. Rehearse them during the day and perform them that very night. Opera singers, it's a lot harder. It's much more in cement in their vocal cords, and changing orchestra parts and all that stuff. It's much more complicated, especially in a repertory house that's doing 3 other operas at the same time. So that just doesn't happen in opera. But in the theater world, you have that out of town tryout 3 weeks. Then you come to New York and you have 3 weeks of previews, and the critics don't come until you've had lots of time experiencing it with an audience. And it's insane that critics come to an opera performance the first time it's performed before a paying audience, So that's just what we're up against, what we have to deal with. But Janine was up for that task and uniquely qualified to do those kind of revisions. And Michael as well, and George as well. And everybody rolled up their sleeves and did it. My role in that was just trying to be another perspective, as I've said, to be the POV, like, I don't know if that's going to be clear to the audience. Oh, I know it's nice to cut and move forward, but maybe we hold on to that one line because it's useful later on at the end. She references it, or even though we lose that reference that's brought back, I guess we can live without it in all for the cause of moving it forward. Like there was a line where in the Washington version, when Eric and Jess meet in the bar and then they go home and they had kind of a makeout scene. And he says to her, she's starting to take off her flight suit so they can fool around. And he says, can you leave it on? I think that would be hot, And she's like, that's against rules and regulations. They have a little joke about it. So that later on in the opera, when they have the argument in Act 2, and he says, please, will you just take off the flight suit when you come home? Because everything has changed. And that was a nice parallel. But in the cutting process, we got rid of that scene where he talked about asking her to keep it on. And as you've seen from reading the play, what's the first line of the play? I never wanted to take it off. So, it would be nice to keep all those references because it's such a rich play script. And it was a very rich libretto that just became more boiled down and concentrated as the process continued.
So we only have a couple minutes left, and we're going to let you go back to shepherding all of these operas to the Met stage. Can you, without giving too much away, because contracts, press, etc., some projects upcoming either in the Met commissioning program or other things that are in the works that you're excited about? I know we've already talked about Lincoln in the Bardo and Cavalier and Clay, but anything that is sort of is cooking in the kitchen that you can tell us about?
Yeah,
well,
since you have your group has read George Brandt, the author of Grounded, play and libretto, we engaged George to write a new libretto for us because Peter Gelb is very committed to supporting Ukraine in the war. He wanted to tell a story that was set in the Ukraine war. So we asked George to come up with an idea. And he came up with a really powerful idea based on a true story, which is about Ukrainian mothers whose children had been sent away to a camp in Crimea to escape the bombing. And it was, Crimea now in Russian hands, but they just thought, oh, they'll go for a couple of weeks and then come back. Everybody thought the war would just blow over. After a few weeks, it turned out that, it kept getting extended. The war was continuing, and they kept saying for the children's safety, the roads back home are not safe, so we're just going to keep them here. And then it ended up being months, and then they started saying that you're not going to get the kids back. So the mothers embarked on a journey to rescue their children, and it was a 3,000-mile journey in which they had to go kind of around the battle zone through Poland and Belarus, and then down through Russia, and then a 1,000-mile drive to Crimea to rescue their children. And some were able to rescue their children and some weren't. So it's a really powerful story, a road story about the resilience of women and the strength of families. And we're really excited to be moving forward with that. It'll be at the Met in a few years.
Awesome. Well, we have that to look forward to. And thank you so much for joining us and for giving us a bit of a behind-the-scenes glimpse into how Grounded came about. And we look forward to seeing it again this weekend live in HD. Thanks a bunch.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.